And I find that when I walk and I talk, all sorts of new things occur to me. And I realize, I'm going to talk about the book, but I want to start by talking about the Middle East and sort of where we are, at least in a somewhat focused fashion. I realize if I bring in the Middle East, there's really nothing for me to talk about. Actually, there is something for me to talk about. I'm going to engage you tonight as well, because I also find that one of the things I learned from teaching is when I engage my students, oftentimes they don't remember what I said, but they always remember what they said. So I'm going to start with a question. I'll ask a number of questions. The good news is every question I pose, I can answer. Okay? What do you think is the most important priority for the Obama administration right now in the Middle East? Iran? Syria? ISIS?
North Korea?
I think Iran was the most important objective for the Obama administration until it got the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Maybe in a Q&A we can talk a little bit about that. I think the most important objective is not Syria. If it was Syria, it would be more active in terms of what it does. I think the most important objective is ISIS. Now, if we're going to succeed in terms of dealing with ISIS, we will not succeed in terms of dealing with ISIS unless we're able to produce Sunni partners, the Sunni tribes, the Sunni governments, and the Secretary of Defense has said he wants to bring the Sunnis into this. And the key to bringing the Sunnis into this is for the Sunnis to believe that, in fact, we are doing something to protect Sunnis. The reason I said if Syria was our priority, we would be doing something more than we're doing in Syria today. And it's not that the president doesn't want to affect Syria, but he's been hesitant to get engaged because he fears it's a slippery slope. That fear of being a slippery slope, however, has put us in a position where the Sunnis don't join us for a simple reason. They look at Syria today, and what they see is increasing American military strikes against ISIS, which is Sunni, and what is a kind of scorched earth policy on the part of the Russians against the non-ISIS Sunni opposition groups. So from a Sunni perspective, it looks like we're engaged in a war on Sunnis. And if we're engaged in a war on Sunnis, whether it's by design or not, they're not going to join us. One of the reasons it's so important to have the Sunnis is not only because they're the only ones who can discredit ISIS, but also, let's say we actually defeat them. So who replaces them?
Shia.
Not the Shia militias. If the Shia militias replace them, we will have the next incarnation of ISIS. ISIS is the reincarnation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So we did, with the surge in Iraq in 2007, we had 100,000 Sunni tribes who made up something known as the Awakening Councils in Iraq. They were promised by us that they would get integrated into the Iraqi security forces. When Maliki came in, the opposite was done. And in the end, you had Sunnis within Iraq who felt they were being oppressed by a government that, in a sense, was not a liberator, but an oppressor. If we succeed in removing ISIS in Mosul, which is the biggest symbol of their success in Iraq, and in Raqqa, which is the capital of their so-called state in Syria, if we don't have Sunni partners, who replaces them? That's the biggest problem we face today, is that there isn't coherence to our strategy in terms of dealing with ISIS. Now, when I talk about this, and it was interesting that when I asked the question, someone said Iran, someone said Syria, someone said ISIS. What you reflected in your questions were what everybody in the region is focused on. Nobody said, by the way, Israelis and Palestinians. Now today we have, for the last 4.5 months, we have almost daily acts of terror against the Israelis. There's several reasons for it. That's something else we may get into more in the discussion. One important factor is alienation from the Palestinian leadership. Another important factor is that nobody in the region is paying any attention. The Arabs are focused entirely on everything but the Palestinians right now. And the Israelis are offering no impression to Palestinians that anything is going to change. And this is combined to create a lot of anger and frustration. There isn't organization to this. This isn't like the first intifada. The first two intifadas have organization, structure, leadership. This has none. Almost all of those carrying out the acts of terror are between the ages of 15 and 25. There are exceptions. We've had 13-year-olds, including now we have one 11-year-old who was arrested, actually today. And we have some who are older, but the vast majority are between the ages of 15 and 25. And they're not organized, they have no leadership, they're reacting in some ways to the kind of climate that ISIS has created in the region. When these acts of terror began, and when they began, they were only stabbings. And by far, most of the attacks remain stabbings. Now, when you think about it, there is nothing more intimate as an act of terror than a stabbing. Literally, it's bloodletting. When the Obama administration first reacted to this for the first 10 days, its reaction was to call for calm and an end to the cycle of violence. Was there a cycle of violence? They were just acts of terror. Now, the reason for 10 days they reacted the way they did is because they didn't want to be seeming to criticize only the Palestinians. They feared that would produce a backlash. And they wanted to bring the Israelis into this by saying a cycle of violence. Now, in criticizing only the Palestinians, as I said, the mindset reflected a concern: how will the Arabs react if we criticize only the Palestinians? How will the Palestinians react if we criticize only the Palestinians? This mindset that produced that response for the first 10 days is a mindset that has been found in every administration from Truman to Obama. Here I seamlessly connected the current events with the book. Brilliantly done, I might say. So, again, every administration has had that mindset. The mindset reflected a constituency that has been a part of the national security apparatus in every administration from Truman to Obama. And that constituency, that mindset, looked at Israel as a problem, not as a partner. All right, so I'm going to pose another question to you. Listen carefully. Is this still on? Yeah.
Yes, you're on.
So I said every administration has had a constituency that viewed Israel as a problem and not a partner. In only one administration did that constituency have no influence. They existed, but they had no influence. So in which administration did the constituency that viewed Israel as a problem, not a partner, have no influence? Bush 43? Bush 43? Is that the guess? You're saying no. But the Bush 43 is a very good guess. In fact, Bush 43 is an excellent guess. It's wrong.
Read the book, you would know.
But it's an excellent guess. No, it's not Reagan. No, it's not, it's absolutely not Nixon. Let me explain why. First, let me explain why Bush 43 is a very good guess. If President Obama were here, he would probably make the same guess. In July of 2009, he met with a senior group of Jewish leaders. And one of them said to him that if you want Israel to move towards peace, you have to be right next to Israel. And the president responded by saying for 8 years there was no daylight between the Bush administration and the Israelis, and the Israelis sat back and did nothing, and it created a problem with the Arabs. Now first, it's wrong on two counts. First, the Israelis didn't sit back and do nothing. Ariel Sharon withdrew 100% from Gaza.
Right.
And one of the reasons that he withdrew 100% from Gaza was precisely because the relationship with Bush was close. Ehud Olmert offered more than the Clinton parameters to Abu Mazen in 2008. Having been the author of the Clinton parameters, it's significant that somebody offered more than the Clinton parameters to Abu Mazen. And again, he did it because the relationship with Bush was very close. So what I just said sounds like Obama, and he was wrong on the issue of the closeness. But the interesting thing was, it's true that Bush was very close, but to show you the weight of the constituency that I'm talking about, the constituency that viewed Israel as a problem and not a partner, the first call that Bush made to Ariel Sharon about a week after 9/11, after Bush had declared a war on terror, in that first call he was pressing Sharon to have his then foreign minister, Shimon Peres, meet with Yasser Arafat. Now, this is in the midst of the Second Intifada. Bombs are going off in Israel. There's no question that Arafat bears a responsibility for these acts of terror in Israel, and yet Bush is pushing Sharon to have his foreign minister meet with Arafat. He wouldn't have dreamed, having declared a war on terror, he wouldn't have dreamed that we should be talking to those responsible for 9/11. But he was pushing Sharon to be dealing with Arafat. And the reason was because some people in the White House, some people in the intelligence community, some people in the State Department were saying to him, 9/11 came about because we were too close to Israel. 9/11 was a function of hostility towards us because of the ties to Israel and because no peace with the Palestinians. And their argument was, unless we can do something on the Palestinians, we will have no partners when it comes to dealing with the war on terror. That constituency pushed him to do that. And over time, he changes. Because he says, in fact, he writes about this in his memoirs, could be one set of rules for the war on terror for us and a different one for Israel and others who are fighting the war on terror. So he does change. But this constituency had that weight at that part of the administration. And again, when you read the Bush chapter of the book, as you all will, when you see it, one of the things you'll see is in 2006, during the war with Hezbollah, that constituency begins to reemerge again. Bush keeps it within bounds. He constrains it because Bush truly evolves in terms of his attitude towards the Israelis. Okay, I'm on a roll. I like asking questions. Clearly you're engaged in answering questions. I'm going to pose another question.
You didn't answer the first.
Oh, you want me to answer the question too? This just proves you're paying attention. It was Clinton. It was Clinton because Clinton was the only president who believed that our relationship with Israel was driven by the fact that we were Israel's only true friend in the world. Right. And if we could have differences with the Israelis, but if we broadcast the differences between us, that would give encouragement to Israel's enemies. It would weaken Israel's deterrent. It would make peace less likely, war more likely, peace less likely. Okay? So can I pose another question? I promise to answer it. All right, so which administration, from Truman to Obama, was the toughest on Israel?
Bush won. First Bush.
For those who don't have it, they have to read it.
Nixon also was
So, all right, so I heard people say Obama, but I also realized Eisenhower was the right answer. Eisenhower came in, first you have to understand that Eisenhower felt that he had a duty to rebalance our policy towards the Middle East and towards the Arabs. He believed that Truman had recognized Israel only because of political reasons, only because of the influence, the Jewish influence. It's actually an amazing view. The reason he holds it is because the so-called wise men, meaning George C. Marshall, the Secretary of State, James Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense, George Kennan, the author of Containment, all the wise men, Robert Lovett, the Undersecretary of State, all of them are against the recognition of the State of Israel. Every single leader in the national security establishment is against the recognition of the State of Israel. There's only one person in the circle around Truman who was pushing hard for it, and he's on the domestic side. Clark Clifford. Right. And in fact, Clifford is in a meeting that when you read the book, you'll read about a meeting on May 12, 1948, where Clifford is making arguments against Marshall and against Lovett on recognition, and Marshall gets so agitated. First he asks, why is he here? And Truman says, well, because I asked him. And then he's so upset over what he says are purely political arguments, none of which, by the way, not one argument that Marshall made was a political argument. Every single argument he made was focused on, look, all of the people who argued around the Secretary of State and the intelligence community said that Israel wasn't viable. We would have to put 500,000 troops in to defend it because it would collapse otherwise. In fact, we did nothing. We had an arms embargo on them. We did nothing and they created a state, and they fought for themselves. And the whole intelligence community said exactly the opposite would take place. George Kennan and Lloyd Henderson, there's an auditorium in the State Department named for Lloyd Henderson, wrote a joint memo to reverse the support for partition, saying, this is several months after partition had been voted, saying that we would have to put hundreds of thousands of troops there, that the Jews weren't sustainable, they weren't viable, and what's more, the fact that there was a Jewish state was going to end up being a boon for the Soviets. They made a series of arguments, and Clifford goes through and debunks every single one of the arguments that they made. He says, when it comes to oil, the Arabs can't drink their oil, they have to sell their oil. Every argument he makes is actually a substantive argument. And Marshall is so agitated, Marshall says, interrupts, cuts him off, says to the president, if you were to accept what he's saying and I were to vote, I mean, he was lifetime military, only five-star general, right? He said, if I were to vote in the election, I wouldn't vote for you. That brings a pause to the meeting, and Truman actually says to him, I'm inclined to agree with you, General. But Lovett is so concerned about this possible breach between the two. That night he goes and he sees Clifford, and they work out that there'll be recognition of the state afterwards. Now the fact is, just to put this in perspective, Eisenhower comes in, Eisenhower thinks we have to rebalance because Truman is driven by domestic political concerns and the influence of the Jews, and he has to change. The only thing that could explain why he would recognize the state was because of political factors. And he thinks, it's not just recognition, he thinks that Truman tilted towards the Israelis. The truth is, the only significant thing that Truman does is recognize the state. He maintains an arms embargo on Israel. When Israel declares itself a state, it's invaded by all its neighbors. We have an arms embargo. There's no arms embargo on the Arabs. The British are providing arms to Egypt. The Arab Legion, which is the military of Transjordan at the time, is financed, armed, and the officers are seconded British officers who lead it fighting the Jews, and they are actually able to seize East Jerusalem. So the only ones who aren't getting armed from the outside are the Jews. It is the state of Israel. And yet Eisenhower viewed Truman as being totally biased in his approach, which in fact he is not. But Eisenhower comes in, he's determined to rectify that. During the 1956 war, when the Israelis, in coordination, collusion with the British and the French, go into the Sinai, Eisenhower actually contemplates the use of American force against the Israelis. He doesn't do it, but instead he threatens sanctions. He says sanctions will be imposed on the Israelis if they don't get out. He has his Undersecretary of State threaten Israel with expulsion from the UN. I mean, these are the kind of things that are pretty extraordinary, right? And so Eisenhower basically adopts a very tough position towards Israel. Now, he doesn't suspend weapons to Israel because he never sells weapons to Israel. He never provides Israel any weapons. In fact, every time the Israelis come in and make a request for arms, the answer that the Eisenhower administration offers is you should seek the goodwill of your neighbors. Now, every one of their neighbors rejects their existence, and every one of their neighbors except Lebanon has fedayeen, literally self-sacrificers, to use their territory to attack Israel. And the Israelis should seek the goodwill of their neighbors who reject their very existence. So this is the Eisenhower approach. So Eisenhower is the toughest on Israel. But as I said, he doesn't suspend weapons to the Israelis because, of course, he never provides weapons to the Israelis. There is one president who suspends weapons to the Israelis as a punishment. Can you guess which president that was?
Nixon.
Nixon suspends weapons to the Israelis, but not as a punishment. I'll explain that later. Only one president suspends weapons to Israel as a punishment.
Bush number one.
Not Bush. Reagan. Not Carter. Who said Reagan? It's Reagan. Reagan suspends F-16s to the Israelis after they bombed the Osiris reactor in Iraq. By the way, later in his diary, what he says is, maybe that wasn't such a bad idea, meaning bombing of the certain Iraq.